And so I was doing interviews on my front lawn while the raid, media interviews while the raid was still underway. And I remember one of the local news reporters in their intro of the story having some comment like, "This is really surprising because we know these people." Which is to say, like I mentioned earlier, we were well known for our organizing in the community. We'd never been shy about or secretive about what we want, what we believe, or what we do. And so the organizing began before the FBI was done at my house.
Welcome to Fight Back Radio, production of fightbacknews.org, taking you to the heart of the people's struggle. I'm your host, Richard Berg, and today we're going to be talking about political repression in the United States. And our guest is Jess Sundin, who has been through this and is a leader of the Committee to Stop FBI Repression. But before we get into the interview with Jess, I wanted to just flip back a little bit. Our guest last week was from Washington, D.C., KB or Kristen Boner. And even before that, we had as a guest Marisol Marquez from Los Angeles. And I'd encourage people to go back and check those episodes out as well, because they talk about the current repression and troops, National Guard that have been sent into those cities. And some of you will remember that I predicted that the National Guard would be coming into Chicago, mostly because Trump had said over and over again that he was going to send the National Guard into Chicago. But fortunately for us, as of today, as I'm recording this again, the Guard isn't here, and he said that he was going to send them instead to Memphis, Tennessee, where there was a governor who wanted them, despite the fact that the mayor of Memphis and the people of Memphis have been pretty unequivocal, like Chicago, that they don't want them. But I want to give a shout out to the movement here in Chicago for keeping Trump at bay in terms of sending in troops and bringing that kind of repression to our city. And a shout out to our mayor, who was unequivocal and said that he would not cooperate with any aspect of this, would not cooperate with sending with the troops or with ICE, the Immigration Customs Enforcement, and all these different types of repression that are been going on. I think it's important to note that Trump's attacks have been mostly on cities where there's large black and brown populations and black and brown mayors. And he's been pretty overt. He's attacking them because they opposed him, because they were not cooperating with him. And we're going to continue to not cooperate. I want to also give a shout out, to the movement, especially the Coalition Against the Trump Agenda here in Chicago, and one of its member organizations. People call it ICER, but it's the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, who have been standing up against Trump's, sending in troops, and standing up against ICE, who have been here, and have, as of now, I think they've rounded up about 30 people that they say are dangerous criminals, but they've only been able to say most of them, I think, are people with traffic violations, but there are some that were serious criminals. And this is millions and millions and millions of dollars are being spent here in Chicago to round up 30 people to disrupt the lives of thousands and thousands of people, the economy of the city, all at a time when we actually need the money for transit, for education, for health care, for so many other things. I'll also add that here in Chicago, just one of our suburbs, Franklin Park, the ICE agents, masked ICE agents, recently shot and killed a man who was, the details of it are still coming out, but they didn't have body cam, and witnesses seem to say that, the guy was fleeing a traffic stop, but wasn't doing anything very dangerous from what I can tell. And and the truth is, our government is not to be trusted with any of this. Their statements, their press releases often turn out to be lies. But I don't want to go on too long. I've already went on a long rant. Don't want to go on much longer because I want to introduce our excellent guest, today, Jess Sundin, who's from the Committee to Stop FBI Repression. She's been an activist with them for since its founding about 15 years ago, and we'll get into how that was founded. It was, it was an attack on her and other activists at the time. At that time, she was a member of the anti-war committee in Minnesota. Today, she's involved with Twin Cities Coalition for Justice, which is an affiliate of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. Also, at that time, she was a member of AFSCME, Local 3800, which is a part of Council 5 in Minnesota. So, welcome to Fight Back Radio, Jess.
Thanks, Richard. Nice to see you.
Yeah. So, anyways, the long introduction of all this craziness under Trump. What do you? Let me just ask you about that. What do you make of these goings on? So, which it's definitely strikingly different from previous presidents, and we have troops being sent into the streets of many major cities in the country, and we're going to be talking about repression. But what do you make of all this?
Yeah, it's definitely a different time than I've seen yet in my life. The I feel like early in the summer when we started to see the ICE mobilizations in Los Angeles, then followed up by mobilizing the troops to assist ICE in their operations there. Los Angeles really set the stage for what the rest of us need to prepare for. And I think, that the choice to fight back as opposed to hide is something that's paid off. You could certainly talk about that from the experience in Chicago. Here in Minneapolis, we had in early June an operation, a federal raid on a Mexican restaurant in the heart of our Latino immigrant community here, like a mile from my house. And it was like the operation was allegedly or supposedly looking at money laundering and maybe drug trafficking. But they raided the restaurant in Minneapolis and several other locations in the suburbs, but only in Minneapolis, in the heart of the immigrant community, did they show up in full military outfit, wearing the fatigues, driving the armored vehicles, armed with the long guns and rifles, masked, of course. And the operation included many federal agencies, including ICE. And it really was aimed clearly to strike terror in the heart of our community. And what was amazing about that moment is that all the like neighborhood Facebook groups and Twitter, threads, everyone immediately responded. And within minutes, hundreds of people were gathered at the site to stand with our immigrant neighbors there. We had on the one hand, we had the mayor telling us it wasn't an immigration operation, while at the same time, hundreds of us were there looking at agents in immigration, ICE and HSI, which is also a division of ICE, badges among those operators. And it was terrifying. And that's clearly what its goal was. But I think the choice to answer it with a mass mobilization of people who care about and support our immigrant neighbors was important. And it's the reason we haven't seen an operation like that again in Minneapolis. Doesn't mean we won't. A lot of us saw that as a test, if you will. And I think that day in Minneapolis passed that test. On the other hand, we did have one really important casualty. Local activist Isabella Lopez was one of the folks who showed up that day. And it was either 1 or 2 days later, she was arrested by the FBI, who caught her just as she stepped outside of a studio where she'd been giving an interview about the events that day. Just as she stepped outside, they snatched her. Just like ICE has been snatching our immigrant relatives in communities across the country. And she was charged with several charges of, resisting the officers that day. And the FBI's case against her is coming up for court in just a few days, September 29th. And so that's one example here in the Twin Cities that's really important to us. We want more people like Isa who are willing to go and stand strong in the face of these shocking, repressive, militarized forces in our neighborhoods. And if we're going to ask our community members to do that, then we have a duty to stand with them when they're in turn attacked by the government, like is happening to Issa right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And wherever it's happening, wherever you hear about
Yeah.
it across the country, when you see your cities, it's important that we turn out and protest. And that's one of the lessons that we'll get into a little bit from your case as well. But before we get there, though, I wanted to ask you also about Los Angeles. I know the Committee Against FBI Repression, and I mentioned earlier we had Marisol Marquez on here, but we talked about Alejandro Oriana, who was an activist there who was picked up by the FBI. Can you tell us a little bit about Alejandro and his case and where that's at right now?
Yeah, as folks will remember, when I started deploying in Los Angeles, the community came out and protested and said no. And what they experienced when they came out in those protests was violence at the hands of ICE and the agencies supporting ICE. And so I think a lot of what LA saw earlier this summer is like what Minneapolis saw in the summer of 2020 after George Floyd was killed, violent military response to protests about that are about protecting and caring for our neighbors. Alejandro was one of the people, one of many people who were part of those protests. And one day, FBI and other agencies showed up at his house to arrest him, alleging that he was part of a conspiracy to create civil unrest, I believe, was the charge. And the particular allegation was that he was allegedly driving a truck that contained protective gear, like face masks for people or goggles. I can't remember exactly, right? But protective gear. And the FBI and the US attorneys decided that was a crime that he should be charged with. In response, Alejandro and their supporters in LA immediately stood up and said, no, we have a right to protest for our immigrant neighbors, and we have a right to protect each other and ourselves while we're doing it. And we stand with Alejandro. And over the course of several weeks, in addition to the folks in Los Angeles supporting them, we had folks around the country doing call-ins, writing supportive statements, solidarity statements, and spreading the word about Alejandro's case as an example of the importance of fighting back against Trump's onslaught on our communities, and an example of how we can and must resist repression when we're doing that work. And so we had the, great news that their charges were dropped before they had to face trial, and Alejandro is free to continue their work now. And the folks that they were organizing with, I'm sure, had an incredible sigh of relief that they too could trust that their work could continue. Um, and I have no doubt that if the charges hadn't been dropped, folks would continue the work anyway. But it's certainly much better to do so with all of your friends and comrades free to do it alongside you. So,
Yeah, yeah, no, thank you for that, and thanks for the update. I mean, great news,
yes.
and I'm sure that the protests and the standing up and the resistance is all part of what leads to this. I mean, if we crawl up in a shell, I think they just keep beating us, and to use I don't know the word, I don't have that analogy, only goes so far, I suppose, but yeah, thank you for that. So I want to go back though now, and it's clearly political repression's been a part of the landscape, for centuries, and the you go back, in this country, in the 20th century, we had the Palmer-Raids, the group that you're a part of now, the National Alliance. Was founded, National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression was founded in the fight against for Angela Davis to be free, who was a political prisoner at that time. And but I want to go back 15 years to September 24th, 2010 when 70 FBI agents simultaneously raided the homes and served subpoenas on prominent anti-war and international solidarity activists, including in Minneapolis, Chicago, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and this included you. Could you talk a little bit about that day and what happened and how that day started out for you?
Yeah. So that day, so I lived with my partner and at that time our 6-year-old kid. And I'm not the morning person in the family. So my partner and my kid were starting to wake up, and we're down on the first floor of the house when they heard this loud banging at our door. Um, we have a kind of an old house, so it just so happens that the porch door like is finicky and you can't just open it. You have to turn it backwards, which led to them um, choosing to pull out their battering ram as they're waiting for someone to come to the door. My partner came to the door and recognized while they were poised with that battering ram, which they did not have to use. But they said they were here to execute a search warrant, searching for evidence of material support to foreign terrorists. There was at least half a dozen agents, and the first thing my partner said is what anyone should say in the same circumstance, which is I do not consent to the search, which made them all pause. And then that sort of FBI agent in charge said, doesn't matter if you consent, we have a signed warrant. Here it is. We read the warrant to make sure it did in fact have our address correct and the other details. And so the search proceeded. I was still in bed. That's the sound I woke up to was the agents stomping into the house. The so it was, something like 7 in the morning on a weekday. And their warrant said that they were looking for correspondence with anyone living in Palestine or Colombia. They wanted any records from my organizing with the anti-war committee at that time. Um, they also wanted anything related to Freedom Road Socialist Organization. They took books, they took my passport, they took my computer, my phone. They searched every room in the house. Our 6-year-old was kind of mad that they searched the kids' room. And a thing the FBI does if they search your house is they put little signs on every room to label it. And Layla's name starts with an L, but there was a different letter on their door. So they were mad about that. Which is just to say, you know, they were coming into the home of just a family and
Yeah.
they searched it for all kinds of things. They went through, my grandfather had died earlier that year, and so I had a lot of his possessions and they went through that. Um, the fact is they were here for several hours, but the first thing that I asked to do was to call an attorney. And so, lucky for me, I do have a National Lawyers Guild leader from here in the Twin Cities who's, in my address book, and they allowed me to use my phone to make that one phone call. As it happened, his name is Bruce Nestor. He did pick up because I don't call him that often, so I think he knew he better pick up just in case. And he was in New Orleans at the national conference for the Guild. Um, he sent word back to the Twin Cities, and I think that's how a lot of people up here found out that it was happening. Um, and he also worked with lawyers that were at the conference to start talking about organizing our defense. As you mentioned, folks in Minneapolis and Chicago were targeted, but there were also, and Michigan, and there were also visits to folks from coast to coast, from North Carolina to California, who were also questioned, if not raided that day. And the offices of the anti-war committee were raided as well. No one was there when that happened because it's a little early for us to get into the all-volunteer office. Um, but what started to happen within an hour was people started showing up at our homes. Word got out about who was being raided. And, all of us are very engaged in our community. This was in 2010. So it comes on the heels of a pretty strong anti-war movement, in the context of the war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq. We had had a large mobilization here in the Twin Cities for the Republican National Convention in 2008. And all the folks that were targeted were leaders of that organizing and were known to our community. And so on my lawn, the first person at my door was actually a childcare worker who would help take care of our kids sometimes in the summer. Um, and he himself was facing state charges of domestic terrorism for his organizing at the Republican National Convention. But he fearlessly knocked on my door and said to the FBI agents, "Hi, I'm here to take care of the kid." And that was a lovely relief because our kid knew him and could hang out on the lawn instead of in the house with these awful forces of repression. And slowly, several more people came as well. And that account is repeated in every house that was targeted here in Minneapolis. And I think people had similar experiences in Chicago as well. Um, from the beginning, we didn't stand alone. The only other thing I'll just add about that day, I mentioned that we were all very engaged in our activism. One of my first questions to my attorney friend was, what should or should I not be saying to anyone else about what's happening? And his advice was, don't say anything you haven't already said on the record, but other than that, you can talk and you should. And so I was doing interviews on my front lawn while the raid, media interviews while the raid was still underway. And I remember one of the local news reporters in their intro of the story having some comment like, "This is really surprising because we know these people." Which is to say, like I mentioned earlier, we were well known for our organizing in the community. We had never been shy about or secretive about what we want, what we believe, or what we do. And so the organizing began before the FBI was done at my house. Yeah.
Okay, let me go back a little bit here. So the what the FBI said is they were looking for evidence of material support to terrorism and for and any correspondence with Colombia or Palestine. But
Yes.
you also said that this relates back to the about the organizing around the Republican National Convention, the protest against the convention. I remember that because I was with the Teamsters at the time. I was president of a local, and we took a couple of buses up to that, and so we
I remember.
participated in those protests. Yes, we worked together a little bit on that, and so I mean, can you talk a little bit about how this came to be, how so the FBI doesn't raid everybody's home. And
Not yet.
yes, not yet. But so you were chosen around issues of Colombia and Palestine and around the protest. It's when John McCain was being nominated to run for president of the United States against Barack Obama was the Democrat that year. So this was in the aftermath of Bush's second term. And so, could you talk a little bit about how, the organizing around the Republican convention led to a raid of your home and others?
Sure. Yeah, so I mentioned that being a period of time where the anti-war movement was, I think, in a period, a high tide of struggle still, with the wars ongoing in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so we organized what I think was the largest anti-war demonstration that year in the country. It was about 30,000 people from across the country. Of course, most of them from in or near the Twin Cities. But as you mentioned, we had buses from Chicago and folks from across the country did come. And our main demand was an end to the wars, to the occupation in Iraq and Afghanistan. And at the same time, we united with the labor movement and the immigrants' rights movement and other movements to talk about money for human needs and not for war. So it was a very broad coalition that included lots of national anti-war organizations and also, other organizations doing work and some of the issues that I mentioned. In that organizing, in the Twin Cities, it was really rich. There was, I mean, every remotely political organization in the city was engaging in some way. And there were lots of layers of protests that happened at the Republican convention. The demonstrations that we organized, the main one was on the first day of the convention. It was a permitted march that started at the state capitol and was set to march to the arena where the convention was happening. But there were other demonstrations planned of different characters as well throughout the week. But one of the things that happened in all that activity was that because any political convention like that is a national security event, the federal security agencies were doing their own, yeah, surveillance and investigation and following the local movement and the organizing here. And in that work, they sent in an undercover agent who ended up joining the anti-war committee at that time. And while she was in the anti-war committee, she learned that we weren't only mad at Republicans, but we were in fact in solidarity with liberation movements in Palestine and Colombia. And she took a great interest in that and clearly talked her handlers into continuing the investigation after the convention itself. And so she is responsible for what became this much more in-depth operation. You mentioned 70. It is in fact 72 federal agents that were deployed on the morning of September 24th. And all of that was on her word, which we eventually were able to get the affidavit that she signed or that she gave to, justify this operation. But in the end, the aim of the government in any case like this is, okay, we have our undercover agent who can say some things, but to put on a real case, we need more than that one witness. And so they aim to get some of the folks who are involved with or somehow adjacent to the targets of their investigation to cooperate with the investigation. And that's why, in addition to the raids and the search on our homes and offices, we were issued subpoenas ordering us to testify to a grand jury that took place in Chicago that initially there were 14 subpoenas served. Myself and my partner each received subpoenas, as did folks from other places. And eventually they expanded it and delivered, I believe, a total of 23 subpoenas to different individuals. And their hope was that some of us would help them. And we're very much committed to not assisting the government, either in repressing any of us or also because all of us had some relationship to international solidarity work. We were very concerned about the possibility of our testimony endangering our comrades in Palestine or Colombia, which have much more repressive and dangerous political conditions than we were facing at that time. So for both those reasons, aside from just generally never talk to the police or the FBI, but for very particular reasons, we chose that we would not participate in the grand jury and none of us testified. And I think ultimately, that's what gets me to be here on your radio show today, 15 years later, instead of in a prison cell somewhere. Not one person agreed to assist the government. No one testified that was called. And with the assistance of the Lawyers Guild, we were able to refuse that grand jury subpoena, and here we are, still free and organizing.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I just want to remind Fight Back Radio listeners, or for the younger ones, tell them for the first time. At that time, Colombia was very much a hot spot. There was a center of whatever the so-called war on drugs, and there was a civil war going on in the country between the. In fact, if you listen just to a couple of episodes ago of Fight Back Radio, we talk about one of the political prisoners from Colombia, who's Simone Trinidad, who's still in jail in Denver from that time. But yes, there was this plan in Colombia of spending, billions of dollars in military hardware to try to, deal in, we were against it, not just when the anti-war movement, but the trade union movement as well. I know we were, the steel workers and Teamsters and others were active in trying to stop, this suppression of trade unionists as well as farmers and other people in Colombia. And then, of course, Palestine is well known. The movement around Palestine is continues and has grown exponentially since that time. So I don't think I need to say too much about that. But let me ask you a little bit about so how the strategy. So you had I'm sure everybody was shocked and surprised by the raids of your homes and that the FBI was targeting you like this. But you were given you said you were given interviews on the front lawn. So you didn't cower clearly. What was the strategy and what kinds of things did you do in the immediate aftermath of the raids and as you said, nobody spoke to the grand jury or to the FBI. Um, how did you maintain that kind of solidarity amongst all these people?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that sort of for the nerds in the group, like on the listening, one of the first things we did was study the history of how other movements before us had responded to this kind of political repression. Um, we looked at the experience of the Black Panthers and also the Puerto Rican Liberation Movement, um, both of which gave us many lessons. But our main response was that we were going to fight. We were not going to be carried off in the night. We were going to fight. And so we did it on a number of fronts. The first was the very first thing that happened after the interviews on my lawn was there was a meeting that was called that evening in Minneapolis at a church in the neighborhood. And hundreds of people came. The church was filled. People were outraged and immediately took up how can we organize to defend these community members who are being targeted. And we tackled it on a number of fronts. We directly protested the FBI and federal buildings across the country, not only here in Minneapolis, but across the country, to demand that the case be closed and dropped. Aside from those kind of grassrootsy protests that I think all of your listeners will be familiar with, we did a couple things that were, I think, unique and different. One thing we did, we wanted to have statements of solidarity from across the movements. And we mentioned that I'm a retiree from AFSCME, but at that time, there were two of us who were AFSCME workers and one AFSCME staff person
So
who were
AFSCME
raised,
is the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. So it's one of the large, not one of it. I think it is the largest public employee union in the United States. Go
right.
ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it's all good. Your listeners need to know. So there was three of us who were directly tied to our AFSCME local and very active in it. And our union president was at the very first press conference, which was also on my front lawn, speaking on our behalf. But just a week or two, I think less than 2 weeks after the raids, was the statewide convention for AFSCME Council 5, which is the sort of statewide umbrella group for the union. And at that convention, a resolution was drafted to stand with us. And that resolution passed overwhelmingly and became almost like a template or an example for what solidarity statements could be like across the country. And so we started to collect statements of solidarity from not only unions, not just the anti-war movement, student movement, faith communities, anything you can think of. But even like in Minnesota, the state legislature took up this resolution that had been drafted, and it was out of session. It wasn't in session in September or October, but a third of our state legislators signed a sign-on letter that was roughly the same text as that AFSCME resolution. So we were immediately seeking broad and public support. And then we decided we needed to target political officials who had something to say, like who would have a line of communication with the DOJ. It may surprise your listeners to know that if you call the U.S. attorney, they're not like ready to chat, with just you or me. That said, senators and representatives have some sway. And so we started lobbying our senators and representatives, first in Chicago and Minneapolis, where most of us lived, and then beyond, to also write dear colleague letters addressing our case and calling for it to be closed. The first letter did come from Minnesota, but it wasn't the best letter. I think the best letter came from Chicago. But that said, aside from letters, we literally sent delegations to DC to lobby elected officials, asking them to support us, to stand with their constituents against this political repression. So we did political, organizing that was both grassroots, but also, directly with federal legislators. And then we did a very we chose to be aggressive in terms of our legal defense. The thing about a grand jury subpoena is one, you don't have a court date. Well, you do, and then you say, I don't want to talk to the grand jury. And then you're just in limbo for however long. And U.S. attorneys, they don't have to do anything. They can just sit on the cases forever and ever and ever. And so we worked with our attorneys at the Lawyers Guild to consistently and at every turn, demand answers in our case. We were aggressive in trying to get our stuff back that had been seized in the raids. Um, we the affidavits, as I mentioned, of our undercover agent, it was sealed, so it wasn't public at first. So we sued to have that released so that we could see exactly the basis for the operation against us. And our attorneys were consistently calling the U.S. attorneys in Chicago to, chase down what's happening with this case. When are you gonna let us go? Instead of waiting, we just stayed on them. And so I think, the choice to have the broad public, oh, I mean, there's so many things we did 15 years ago. Another thing we did is we had national conferences. I think the first one was in Chicago. There was also one in New York. There was a regional conference in North Carolina, and these were all Committee to Stop FBI Repression conferences to organize other people to stand with us in our case. And also, in each of those conferences, we united with other targets of the government who'd been targeted with that same law, the law barring material support to foreign terrorism. And just to be clear, I just want to take an aside. Material support to foreign terrorism sounds like you're sending guns and money, but it's not. It's literally sharing the ideas of talking at free speech was basically what we were being targeted for speaking in ways that were supportive of liberation movements, some of which our government has chosen to for its own political reasons, placed on a terrorism list. That said, so the national conferences, all these conferences, we didn't just say it's only about us. We also had, in Chicago, we had family of Dr. Abdelhalim Ashkar. Dr. Ashkar was prosecuted by the same U.S. attorney that we were being targeted by. And then when he refused to speak to the grand jury, he was actually held in contempt of court and spent, I believe, 11 years in jail for contempt of court for refusing to testify to a grand jury.
Oh my
We
God.
had family members of Samuel Arian, who's a Palestinian professor who at the time was in Florida, who came and spoke at these conferences. Um, at least one of the Holy Land Five kids, the children of one of them, spoke at a conference. So we really tried to unite our struggle with others who are predominantly Muslims and Palestinians who were facing similar targeting by the government, and lift up their cases as well. And the last thing I'll add that we sort of made a strong connection with early on was other movements in the United States that had in the past experienced similar political repression. And in particular, that would mean, especially in Chicago, the Puerto Rican movement, and in some places also very strong ties were built with the Black Liberation Movement, both of which had been targeted by COINTELPRO and the FBI in the past. And so had experience that we wanted to borrow from, learn from, and lift up as good examples.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yes, I mean, wow. Um, Ultimately, all this was successful, but before I wanted to ask you though a little bit about the grand jury, and most people don't know what a grand jury is, or they may have seen it on a murder show briefly or something like
Yep.
that. But can you talk a little bit about you were subpoenaed to testify in front of the grand jury, and you chose, all of you chose not to do that. Can you talk a little about what a grand jury is and what the role of a grand jury is,
Yeah.
and why you said we're not going to talk to them?
Yeah. So a grand jury is used to it's sort of a pre-charging part of the process in federal crimes and some state crimes as well. But that's going to be different in every state, so I'm not going to talk about that. So in our case, in order to bring charges against us, they would have to get a grand jury to say, yes, bring the charges. And so the goal of the grand jury is to help the prosecutors. Basically, it's almost like I would understand it as establish probable cause. I don't know if that's legally right, but like as a non-legal person, that's how I understand it. So they needed a jury of civilians or citizens from the area to be able to say, yeah, no, I think they did something. You should prosecute them. So that's the goal of a grand jury. Some wild things about a grand jury that I did not know until 15 years ago, or I didn't really know, is you think it might be in a courtroom with a judge, but it's not. There's no judge. There's actually also no defense attorney because you're not necessarily on trial. You're just like saying stuff to this grand jury. The only sort of authority in the courtroom is the prosecutor. And so they present the case, they ask the questions, and they direct the conduct of the grand jury itself. What that means is, I think lawyers have a joke. They say that a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich. Um, and the point of that is to say it doesn't take much if there's only one side presenting everything for a jury to be like, yeah, okay. And
Yeah.
so it's a very legally, it's a very wild thing that even exists and is allowed. Some problems with a grand jury. Another thing they say about a grand jury is it's like a circular firing squad. So let's say me and you and seven other people go into the grand jury. Let's say we do testify. We answer their questions. But let's say even though you and I know the same things, we like remember it differently because we're not 20 anymore, so we forget things. Once we start saying different pieces of things, we can accidentally um, make each other's testimony sound not true or confirm facts that aren't significant to us, but somehow they piece them together. Again, remember, no one except the prosecutor and the jury is in there the whole time. So I might say, Richard and I had lunch on Tuesday, and that's all I said. But they get six other people to say, at lunch on Tuesday, I smelled someone cooking sulfur in the back of the restaurant. I don't know what. Like, right? And all of a sudden, these unrelated facts become, shoot, maybe Jess and Richard were cooking up sulfur bombs. I don't even think there's sulfur in bombs. I don't know anything about it. But my point is, it's a very dangerous operation in that you can accidentally or unwittingly incriminate yourself or others because you don't have the whole story and you don't have an attorney looking out for your best interests. The other piece is that it's very worrisome in the movement. If someone is testifying to a grand jury, we don't ever know what you said there. And so it risks sowing mistrust within the movement if some of our movement activists are in a secret courtroom saying secret things that we never know about. So it has the potential to be really divisive. So it's legally dangerous to participate for yourself. Oh, and they can ask you anything because again, there's not a defense attorney to say objection. There's not a judge to say out of order. And that's where, in particular, our worry about our international friends in Palestine and Colombia came up. Should they ask, I did travel to Colombia, and if I started talking about that, who did you meet with? Where did you meet with them? What were they doing? Having those names on the record with the U.S. government certainly places them at risk at home in Colombia or Palestine.
Yeah.
So that's my quick and dirty, I guess, or that's what I got for you on a grand jury.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. And just to say also, this whole thing about I want to go back to the material support for terrorism. That was a relatively new law or interpretation at the
Yeah,
time because I remember thinking, I was active in my youth against apartheid in South Africa, and Nelson Mandela and all these guys by the United States government and the State Department were considered terrorists, and so anything we would have done to oppose apartheid in South Africa could be considered material support for terrorism. And today, all the work that people are doing to support the Palestinians, virtually anybody who says anything positive about Palestine in an organized way in Palestine is considered a terrorist by the United States government and the Israeli government. So it's a deep threat on your freedom of speech.
yeah,
Uh, I want to go to the so this whole witch hunt against you went through several different phases in my mind anyways. I mean, first they were attacking a group of people in Minnesota and Chicago. Then they seemed to focus on a number of Palestinians, and then it went, and then it moved to Carlos Montes, who is an activist. He's been a guest on Fight Back Radio a few times. He's a veteran a Chicano activist in Southern California, and I'm hoping could you tell us a little bit about what was going on there and how did it land on Carlos, and then eventually Rasmia Oda, who I want to talk about next. But let's start out with Carlos.
Yeah, so, an operation like this, the FBI is definitely hoping to catch whoever they can. Um, and again, this is in 2010. Obama was president, and for most of us, it was a different time than it is right now, but right now it's feeling very familiar to me. Um, so one of the things they were looking into and that our undercover agent was very interested in was meeting people from around the country that were doing similar work. Carlos had been organizing at that time with Latinos Against War, and he was a speaker at the Republican National Convention and was here for the protests. And so that's when the undercover agent, met him. Um, but Carlos's history in organizing is much longer than that, and exactly how it was done, I don't see behind the curtain, but his record includes as a young man, he was very involved in the Brown Berets, in the fight for Chicano liberation in East LA, and there was an old case that had since been resolved, um, where I believe the allegation was that he had thrown a soda can at a police officer. I might have that wrong, but it was something like that. And the case, there's a funny thing in California law about felonies and misdemeanors that's just different. It's not familiar to me because I'm not from there. But his case was charged one way but resolved another way, I guess is how I would put it. And so on the one hand, he didn't have a felony record and thus was a legal gun owner is a legal gun owner in California. But the FBI found this very old case, which, as I said, had sort of been charged differently because California is different. And in lots of ways, as a Midwest gal, but this is one of them. And so they claimed he was a felon in possession of firearms, even though again they were legally purchased and registered firearms. That was the literal crime that he ended up being prosecuted for. That said, he was arrested by the government, like breaking down his door, like it was like busted, not just like off the hinges, but like broken the door. In the early morning, he was questioned about his activism, not about this case of a felony in possession, but about his current activism. And it was very clear that his case was tied to ours based on some of the questions that they asked him. And so it's sort of a bizarre coincidence is when I found out what had happened to Carlos, we were in the offices of the Anti-War Committee about to hold a press conference. And our press conference was going to reveal the identity of the undercover agent because we had confirmed her identity at that point, and it was just part of our public campaign to raise attention on our case and call for an end to it. And then we get this call about what has happened to Carlos. And so, of course, immediately we pivoted. None of us had charges. We just had this secret grand jury pending in the ether situation. Carlos had real charges. And so we immediately pivoted to an aggressive defense campaign for Carlos, including working and fundraising to get him a good legal defense, but also doing the kind of national public campaign to call for the charges to be dropped. Um, he, we had people from across the country calling in and signing petitions. He was able to speak. My memory is this is old technology. We did a nice event here via Skype before the days of Zoom. But we wanted people to know his story. He's an amazing he's a treasure in terms of the history of this country. He's incredibly charming. So having people get to know him was an important part of his defense. I went to LA for about a week and doing some organizing around his case and stayed with him. But we were able to get his case resolved without him serving any time or having any penalties because it was an unjust case and because we had this amazing broad support that we built for him.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's interesting. So let me well, first let me just say that Carlos has been a guest on Fight Back Radio a few times, and he is charming for sure. And people should go back and check those out. Maybe we'll put them in the show notes as well. Because we have episodes where he talks about his whole history as an activist from a young man going forward, and then also episodes where he talks about the politics of the Chicano nation today. So yes. So then I want to go then to I mentioned Rasmia Oda. So how did she get looped into this, like Carlos getting looped in, I guess. But can you talk about what exactly happened there? And her case lasted much longer, and if you could tell us how that progressed and what happened there.
Yeah, so Rasmia is an incredible organizer who was living in Chicago at the time. She'd been in the US for about 20 years and happened to work with was a work colleague of one of the folks who was targeted in our case, Hatem Abudeya, who I believe has also been on Fight Back Radio.
Yes,
And
yes, he has.
Rasmia, yeah, they both worked at the AAAN, the Arab American Action Network. And her work principally was organizing. You could say it better than me because you actually knew her much longer than me, probably, but and it was in your city, but she was principally an organizer of um, immigrants and refugee women from the, Palestinian and other Arab communities. And she was an incredible organizer. Um, I don't think our spy ever met her, but when the government started looking through all of us and all of our associations, they took an interest in her story. When Rasmia had been a political prisoner in Palestine as a young woman, and after I believe 10 years in Israeli prisons, was released as part of a prisoner exchange that I believe the United States was the party to negotiating that exchange. And after her release, eventually moved to the U.S., first to Detroit, I think, or the Detroit area where her brother lived, and then was in Chicago for at least 10 years doing the organizing I was talking about. When Rasmia came to the U.S., I've never been an immigrant who's filed this paperwork, but you have to apply. And so again, first she came, I think as had I don't know if it was an asylum or refugee claim originally, but first came as an immigrant and then was naturalized about 10 years later and became a US citizen. And somewhere in that paperwork, when the FBI took an interest in her, they found what they decided was a discrepancy on one of the forms that she filled out in her applications. And my recollection is that it was a question about have you ever been convicted of a crime? And Rasmia's understanding of that question, since the government knew that she was a political prisoner that they had helped negotiate the release of, was that it was a question about her time in the United States. This was when she was filing for citizenship. And so she said no, because she doesn't have any criminal history in the United States. But the government decided to pursue an immigration violation against her and sought to revoke her citizenship and deport her. The whole case against her was based on her activism in Palestine, and it was an attempt to smear her work in. I mean, she's an icon of the Palestinian liberation movement. She's a hero to the Palestinian people in their struggle. And the government tried to say that her contributions to the liberation struggle were crimes. And not only that, that her failure to disclose them on this form meant that she wasn't entitled to stay anymore. Um, that's my best summation of what the case was about. But we understood that it was really about, her amazing organizing and wanting to stop that. And so we immediately built a massive campaign to defend Rasmia. The biggest part of that was in your city, Richard. So I don't want to overspeak about that because I never lived there. But I know for her court was mostly took place in Detroit, but she was living in Chicago. So every time there was a court date, Chicago was filling busloads of people from the AAAN, from also the Alliance, the Chicago Alliance folks came out, and other folks in the movement came out to support her. Um, People from Minneapolis came. It's a bit of a longer drive for us, but we made it too. Um, and in fact, it became a case of national concern because it was clearly the targeting of a Palestinian hero for her fight for Palestine. And the immigration charges were just bogus. Um, in her case, the choice was made in her legal defense. Her choice was to put Israel on trial. She said, okay, we're going to talk about it. Let's talk about what they did to me and what they did to us. Rasmia was tortured as a political prisoner, including sexual assault. Um, and she, very bravely chose to share not only that experience, but also the history of um, the dispossession of her family and her people from their lands over, beginning when she was a child and ongoing. And at every turn, the prosecutor and the judge tried to stop Rasmia from speaking and her attorneys from giving evidence that really established the truth of what happened to Rasmia and the Palestinian people and the role of the U.S. in supporting Israel's occupation and crimes against the Palestinian people. And it was really difficult. I'll just add one more piece. Aside from the mobilization of people from elsewhere, we did a lot of work to organize the Palestinian community in the Detroit area, namely in Dearborn, of course, which is like a suburb of Detroit. And that's why I spent about a month in Dearborn doing organizing, helping get the community out to support her. But her case had a national profile. Angela Davis wrote about her case and was published in the Detroit News, reported, with a opinion piece in support of Rasmia. She was well understood as a political prisoner. In her first case, she lost. But we appealed it. And in her appeal, I say we, I just sat back and let the lawyers and Rasmia do things. They appealed it, we appealed it. And in the appeal, the appeals court agreed that the judge had wrongfully excluded some testimony that was very important to us for her defense. And it was particularly about the impact of torture on the psychology of Rasmia or someone like Rasmia. And so the exclusion of that evidence, the appeals court ruled was wrong and sent it back to the first court to retry or whatever the legal process is. I'm out of my depth now. So we won the appeal. We proceeded to the appeals court. But in that time, a thing that happened was Trump was elected the first time, and the Department of Justice personnel changed, and they refiled new charges against Rasmia, which were going to be much more difficult. And it was I should say, the same fundamental charge of an immigration violation, but the new filing really went after her activism for Palestine much more heavily. And so Rasmia made the decision to not pursue the appeal and ultimately was deported to Jordan, where she is now.
Yeah, yeah. I'll just say, um, she truly is an icon here in Chicago, especially amongst Arab women, where she led the Arab women's organizing with the Arab American Action Network, and it's truly a loss for our city to have her be deported like that. I know the goal was to incarcerate her, not just to deport her. So there's a partial victory there. And similarly with everybody that we're talking about here, Carlos Montes and you too, Jess, was to incarcerate everyone. And so the fact that no one is incarcerated from this FBI informant is a victory of sorts, but it makes us aware that our enemies will attack us. In terms of who are your friends and who are your enemies, let's start out with the enemies a little bit here. I mentioned earlier that much of this happened at the end of George W. Bush's presidency, but and you just, said that when Trump took office, there was a different thing. But Barack Obama was president of the United States during most of this, and
Mhm.
Eric Holder was his attorney general. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Democrats and Republicans, the Department of Justice, and
Yeah.
what your experiences are here, and how we, because a lot of people are saying, well, we just need to get a Democrat elected and everything will be cool.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what your opinions of that are after having been through all this.
Well, it might not surprise your listeners to know I don't agree with that. Um, I would actually add that the material support law that we were charged under was established under Bill Clinton, under his presidency. It was the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act in 96, probably. Um, my point of mentioning that is, and then yes, Eric Holder was the Attorney General who was sort of overseeing the prosecution in our case, or the attempted prosecution, I should say. Um, and our experience also with Democratic politicians, I mentioned that we did lobbying. Our own state senator, Amy Klobuchar, who is somewhat popular, less every day as they are, but she's a former prosecutor, and she said, "I won't talk to you." She's like 10 feet away. Like she's like, she wouldn't even speak to us, and she's a Democrat. And so our experience was that at least the core of the Democratic Party, my experience was the core of the Democratic Party, at least the machine, the national leadership, really has no interest in protecting our civil liberties. Um, in fact, my experience was that they created the legal architecture by which I was pursued. Um, and then it was Obama's DOJ that pursued our case, and initially Arrestmia's and Carlos's as well. And so I don't think we should understand the Democrats as the antidote. What is true is, or has been true in our experience, was the Democrats have there's just a little pull, just a little tie. They're just, you can tug at them a little, you know? And I guess by that I mean, um, if you can build enough public support from your community, or nationally, as the case may be, um, you can influence them. So it's not a point of principle for them, but I think that Democrats see it as their place should be to be on the right side of such questions, the correct side, I should say, of such questions. And so if we can make it untenable for them to not protect us, then a little bit they might. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't trust them much, but I feel like I can push them a bit. And Republicans are a lot harder to push.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I know at the time, um, I was one of the people that went to lobby. We went to Washington, D.C. and to lobby Congress and we didn't even, I think we talked to one Republican, but mostly we were targeting people from the Progressive Caucus, the most radical or progressive, I don't know, radical's the right word, to try to talk to. And it was really difficult. I mean, Bernie Sanders was difficult. You go through the list, and
Yeah.
people you would have thought would have been much, easier that are, project themselves in their districts as, being, of the people. I want to give a shout out to as I remember at the time, the UE, or the United Electric Radio Machine Workers of America, were their lobbyists helped guide us through some of it. Chris Townsend, who's now retired, but they were very helpful in certain sections of organized labor. I know were helpful at that time. I remember the World Federation of Trade Unions, which is an international organization of the anti-capitalist labor unions in the world, and they passed a resolution supporting y'all. But yeah, I mean, yeah, we went through this, this whole list of different, and they were all asking, well, who else has signed on? It's like,
Yes.
I mean, no courage at all. There was like, if
None.
there was a more spineless group, I can't imagine who it would have been. But uh, but I want to ask you though, and go back to this, these at the time there was certain know your rights trainings and stuff like that, and then I know here in Chicago with immigrant rights, that's been an important piece of talking to immigrant families about how to protect yourself from ICE and these masked men in the streets and stuff like that. And but this is also true for political work. And you mentioned some of the things that you did when the FBI was at the door, or that your partner did. Could you talk a little bit about know your rights and what kinds of things people should be doing? And you mentioned the National Lawyers Guild as well. I want to give them a shout out because I know they've done a lot of work in your campaign and others since then. But could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, a good starting point is actually that I believe the guild still has on their website when an agent knocks. It's like it's a bit long to call it a pamphlet, maybe a booklet, but it has really a much more in-depth bit of info that I think is worthwhile. Um, I think there's also a lot of Palestine organizations that have been doing a lot of new education in addition to the immigrants' rights movement that you mentioned, Richard. Um, but I think, you know, it's hard to like pick like just a few lessons and say these are the ones. I think the most important thing is for people to take some time to study up on what their rights are, and to know them. The second is if you're engaged in activism, if you're doing organizing, especially in a public way in your community, it's really important that you know what to do if an agent knocks. And so start with that National Lawyers Guild booklet, or if there are other resources that are better in your community, use those. We need to know that um, I never thought I did anything wrong. Just to be clear, I still don't. Nothing that they were looking at, do I regret? I don't think any of it was illegal, but I know none of it was wrong. And so it is not a question of whether or not you are doing the right thing. It's a question of how you can protect yourself against a government that is opposed to you doing anything. Really, the government wants us to be quiet and complicit. And if you're not being quiet and complicit, you are a potential target for government repression. And you should be prepared to do everything you can to protect yourself against that. And that certainly includes not talking to law enforcement if you're questioned, certainly not without an attorney. But it also includes, I think a lot of times people want to talk about security measures. What are all the ways we can keep our secrets? And I want to counter that and say the most effective thing we can do to protect ourselves is to be known and rooted in our communities. Um, Yes, I fought back. Yes, the attorneys helped me, but it was the broader community that knew me and believed in me and that stood by me that I credit to my freedom today. And so to me, yes, we need to know our rights. And also we need to not just sit on them. We have to use them. And I think that in particular, there's some amazing work happening in different communities in our city. It's being led by Minnesota Immigrant Rights Action Committee. They've done certainly dozens. I wouldn't be surprised if it was more than 100 now. Know your rights trainings in the community, but also training people on how to how to respond to ICE raids should they happen. And they're very much including both knowing your rights, but also talking about how to actively use all the rights that you have to protect each other in your communities.
Yeah, yeah. And I would add to that solidarity as well. I mean, deeply rooted, but I know the Committee to Stop FBI Repression, which it still exists today, despite the fact that you've all beaten the rap, as they say, or to some degree. Um, and you continue to speak out for different, people that are victims of FBI repression, whether it's Islamophobia or whatever, any kind of political action or whatever. And I think that's important. We'll put in the show notes the website for and the contact info for Stop FBI Repression. But we're starting to wind down here. This has been an excellent discussion, marking 15 years since that ominous day. But I want to give you a chance if there's anything that we haven't said here that you would like to add to the discussion or anything you want to uplift. Now is a good
Yeah.
time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
A couple of things. I'll say I've been reflecting on it's been 15 years. I don't think we said, and your listeners may not be aware, that every count of material support for terrorism is gets you 15 years in prison. And so I've been thinking about how if we had lost, I'd be in prison today, and how much I've done and how much I've lived in those 15 years. My 6-year-old is now a 21-year-old organizer with the new SDS here at the University of Minnesota.
All
Um,
right.
I know, it's amazing. And, 15 years ago, we were meeting with lawyers about who would care for our child if we were both incarcerated.
Yeah.
And so I want to both offer, you know, political repression is very serious. It's very heavy. It tears apart families, or it can, and it weighs very heavily on individuals who are targeted. And the best thing that we can do to fight political repression is stand with those who are targeted. Not being alone is what makes us stronger. I was stronger because I was never alone. And I want to thank everyone that stood with us in all the different ways that they did. Um, you saved our lives, we really did. And I can't understate how much that means to me. I think about it all the time, but especially around the anniversaries, of course. But I also, you know, I want people to understand the FBI are the political police. This guy, Kash Patel, he's kind of a clown, the new director of the
Yep.
FBI.
FBI
But the
director.
FBI has always been the political police. They've targeted any progressive movement at any time in history whenever they can. And their aim isn't to enforce laws. Their aim isn't to keep American people safe. Their aim is to silence us. And everything I continue to do and my continued activism is aimed at making sure that that one undercover agent and everyone she ever worked with feels like a failure because they failed to catch me or any of the rest of us back in 15 years ago. And I want to end by asking folks, by the time your show goes up, we should have it up on the website. We're going to be sharing some actions people can take to support Isabella Lopez here in the Twin Cities, the activist I mentioned, who's being targeted by the FBI right now and who has a court case coming up on the 29th. So I ask your listeners to look out for that. And please stand with Isa and all other targets of political repression and keep organizing. Give them more work, not less, and let's make them fail over and over and over again.
All right, that's a good way to end it. So, if you were inspired by this, go to the Stop FBI Repression site and stand up for Isa. Even if you weren't inspired, stand up for Isa.
Yes,
But
please.
and continue to fight. Yes, definitely continue to fight back. Yes. Thank you so much for being our guest on Fight Back Radio, Jess.
Thank you for having me, Richard. Take care.
Okay, so just as part of the outro today, I wanted to first give our thoughts are with the people of Palestine, as always, and as they have been for the last few years, as the genocide there continues. Even now, the United Nations and United States Senator Sanders have finally said that there's a genocide. And so, it's a hard time. I know for the people there. We looking at Gaza City as people just go in. They have nowhere to go, and aid workers, they don't know what to say to them, and it just the death just keeps mounting. And so, but we need to resist. We need to continue. The whole world is with the people of Palestine, even if the leaders of the United States are not. And so we need to continue to push our leaders to have some sense of humanity. And we need to continue to support the national liberation movements in Palestine. So I wanted to mention that. And so go to a protest. I mean, they've been protests every week for 2 years here in Chicago. I'm sure there's protests in other places. And whatever you can do to support the people of Palestine, you should be doing that. Also, I wanted to give a shout out to sisters, brothers, siblings in Teamsters Local 320 in Minnesota. We're at the University of Minnesota. They just completed a strike that was by all accounts, victorious. You can read about it in Fight Back News. And I know, especially in these days of Donald Trump and the huge corporate offensive, it's difficult, but they stuck together. And, the Farm Aid people, led by Willie Nelson and other musicians, and IATSE union members, said that they would honor the picket lines, and that was an important, if not a decisive factor. But I know nobody supports you if you don't support yourself. And certainly the sisters, brothers, siblings at the University of Minnesota, and I believe this is mostly like janitorial staff and food service and jobs like that. So shout out to Teamsters Local 320 workers. And finally, I mentioned our last episode that we're coming up on episode 100. And so we're looking for your ideas. Who's the guest you want? What kind of format? We can try different things. We're open-minded here. So let us know. Send something to one of our social media things that are in the show notes. Or you can send an email to richard.fightbackradio@gmail.com. So let's do something fun for episode 100. And then finally, I want to thank our production team, Dodd McColgan, Shane Tremley, Lane Dorsey, and Caetano Silvera. And I'm Richard Berg for the entire Fight Back Radio team, saying until next time, all power to the people.